Hey everybody, Matthew Morris, Wood Studio, and I just finished filming the chapter where I put the breadboard ends on this tabletop for this green and green Gamble House inspired coffee table. Now the secret to this tabletop here is this guy right here. 2 pieces of plywood, 2 pieces of MDF, some glue, and some brad nails. Now this jig here enables you to do 2 really awesome things. Number 1, tackle cutting a very wide tabletop to length if your table saw can't handle something that deep. So I don't have a table saw that could handle cross-cutting this guy, so I turned to this. And then I turned to this guy again when I cut the tenons for my breadboard ends. So let me show you how to make this and then show you how I use it on this tabletop. The first thing I did was find a piece of MDF which perfectly matches the 3/4 of an inch thick for my tabletop, and I jointed one edge. And then I took some 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood and I jointed 2 edges of that plywood. Over at the table saw, I cut my 3/4 inch MDF 1 inch wide, and I cut my 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood 3 inches wide, referencing the 2 sides that I had jointed at the jointer. And then at my crosscut sled, I cut the plywood to 28 inches long, referencing the edge that I had jointed. And then with the MDF, I cut that to 3 inches long. That's where we are now with these 4 pieces. Why don't we put the jig together? The first thing I'm gonna do is grab a little bit of glue and put that on top of my MDF. Now I'm gonna take this piece of 3/4 inch plywood and feel what's flush. I want to be flush on this side, which happens to be a side I jointed. And I want this, the outside of the MDF, to also be flush. Once you think you have that, shoot some brads in. Make sure to stay away from the edge though. So I'm going to go for this edge. I'm aligning to the same edge, so for now, that edge is here towards me and not the outside edge. So I'm going to come over here and throw some clamping pressure over this. Slide it on. I'm going to use this piece of this clamp here. Provide a little bit of pressure. I'm going to loosen it up just enough so it holds everything. And I'm going to take this and push the whole jig against the edge here of the tabletop, and that's going to help square everything up. And that's when I'm going to just clamp it up a little bit more. Now before I affix this MDF to these 2 pieces, what I'm going to do is take some blue tape here and put it on my MDF to just give myself a little bit of spacing. And now I'm going to put a little bit of glue on the MDF and get this in between and get these guys lined up. Okay, I'm going to start with the top, shoot some brads in. Then I move to the bottom and shoot some brads in. And if for some reason you don't get everything to line up perfectly, don't worry about it. Head over to the jointer, joint your edges, and get everything nice and flat. Now, what you want to do is take your jig, bring it in far enough so when you take your circular saw, that when you lay it down nice and flat, you have the blade coming into the piece a little bit to make your first cut here. So I want to make sure I'm making a cut all the way along the length. And once I'm in deep enough for that, what I like to do is take my square and line it up against the end here, and then just make sure that my jig is square, clamp it down. Now if this clamped down, the other thing you want to do is you want to make sure that the height of the blade is deep enough but high enough that as you come across this entire piece, that the motor of the circular saw will be on top of your clamps. And once you've got all that set up, make your cut. And for safety, I'm clamping down my tabletop to the top of my table saw. So now I work to get the jig square and the bit lined up to the line that I drew 3/4 of an inch in from the edge of my tabletop. And once you think you're there, square up your assembly. And at the top clamp down, I take a series of passes on both sides, removing the waste to create my tenon. When I make these cuts, I take a little bit off at a time, putting all of my pressure onto the top of the tabletop, guide the router along the fence. Now, when I come to the very end, you'll see that I make sure to do a climb cut at the end, and that helps to prevent tear out. Now, isn't it pretty awesome what you could do with just some plywood, MDF glue, and some brad nails? Now, this tabletop with the breadboard ends is a hallmark green and green statement in their furniture. And hopefully, if you ever decide to build something like this as a large tabletop, you can make something like this to help you make your breadboard ends or just cut your tabletop to length. Now, jigs like this are the hallmark of how I approach my classes for the Wood Studio online woodworking school. Every single time there is something going on that would normally require some really expensive piece of machinery, instead I make a jig and show you how to build it. And here, this saves you from having to buy some type of track saw, for instance, if your table saw doesn't have the capacity to cut something to length along how deep this piece is. So as always, please subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends, and hit that thumbs up button if you like this video and this jig. If you're watching this on Facebook, hit the like button, share it in your timeline, and head over to the Wood Studio page and like us as well. And as always, have a great week in the shop.